In the glittering heart of 1920s London, a fashion show at the Grand Palais turns deadly when venomous critic Roland Pierce is found stabbed with a silver letter opener, a note in his hand warning, "You'll pay for your words." Enter Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster whose knitting needles unravel secrets as deftly as they weave wool. As whispers of scandal and betrayal swirl among the suspects, desperate designer Marcel Duval, poised model Celeste Varon, ambitious editor Lydia Crane, and vengeful rival Victor Hale. Miss Marple uncovers a web of pride, fear, and hidden motives. With a deliberate blackout, a missing letter opener, and a damning article threatening ruin, only one truth emerges: Marcel's deadly act to silence a critic's pen. In a world where glamour hides dark secrets, Miss Marple stitches together the clues to reveal a killer, proving no thread escapes her notice. Chapter 1. The velvet curtain falls. The Grand Palais, a glittering jewel in London's crown, stood resplendent under the autumn dusk, its chandeliers casting a golden glow over the assembled crowd. The air thrummed with the low hum of anticipation, the sort that precedes a spectacle of high fashion. Fur stoles and silk scarves rustled as the elite of the couture world, editors with sharp pencils, models with sharper cheekbones, and critics with even sharper tongues, settled into their seats. The occasion was Marcel Duval's winter collection, a debut whispered to be either revolutionary or ruinous. Among the perfumed throng, in a modest seat in the third row, sat Miss Jane Marple, her gray hair neatly pinned, her hands busy with a pair of knitting needles that clicked with the quiet precision of a metronome. Miss Marple had come at the insistence of her niece, Joan, an art enthusiast with a passing interest in fashion's pageantry. "You'll enjoy the drama, Aunt Jane," Joan had said, and Miss Marple, ever indulgent, had agreed, though her interest lay less in hemlines than in human nature. Her mild blue eyes, deceptively soft behind steel-rimmed spectacles, roamed the room, noting the undercurrents beneath the polished surface. There was Marcel Duval himself, pacing near the stage, his thin frame swathed in a crimson scarf, his fingers twitching as if threading an invisible needle. To his left, Celeste Varon, the star model, stood statuesque, her platinum hair gleaming, her gaze distant yet imperious, as if the room were hers to command. Across the aisle, Lydia Crane, editor of Vogue Elegance, scribbled in a notebook, her lips pursed in a way that suggested calculation rather than curiosity. And then there was Victor Hale, Marcel's rival, his flamboyant gestures and loud laughter drawing eyes, though his smile seemed to Miss Marple a touch too forced. The orchestra struck a dramatic chord, and the lights began to dim, plunging the room into a hush. Miss Marple's needles paused as she sensed the shift in atmosphere, the collective breath held as the first model was due to appear. But before the velvet curtain could part, a scream, sharp, raw, and unmistakably human, tore through the silence. Gasps rippled outward, and the lights flickered back on, revealing a scene that froze the blood of even the most jaded onlookers. In the front row, slumped in his gilded chair, was Roland Pierce, the fashion critic whose acid pen had felled careers with a single stroke. His head lolled back, his face ashen, and from his chest protruded the gleaming handle of a silver letter opener, its blade buried deep. A thin trickle of blood stained his pristine white shirt, pooling on the floor like spilled ink. The room erupted. A woman in a feathered hat fainted, her companion fumbling to revive her. Marcel Duval stood rooted backstage, his scarf slipping from his shoulder, his eyes wide with something that might have been shock or fear. Celeste Varon, poised at the runway's edge, clutched a fellow model's arm, her composure cracking like fine porcelain. Lydia Crane snapped her notebook shut, her face unreadable, while Victor Hale's laughter ceased abruptly, his hand rising to his mouth. Miss Marple, alone in her calm, set her knitting into her tapestry bag and rose, her small figure moving toward the chaos with the quiet determination of one accustomed to untangling life's darker threads. A young usher, pale and stammering, called for order, but it was the arrival of the police that restored a semblance of control. Inspector Craddock, a sturdy man with a perpetually furrowed brow, pushed through the crowd, his men cordoning off the front row. He spotted Miss Marple and gave a resigned nod. Their paths had crossed before, and he knew her unassuming air belied a mind as sharp as the weapon now embedded in Roland Pierce. "Miss Marple," he said gruffly, "I suppose you've already started solving this one." "Not at all, Inspector," she replied, her voice gentle but her eyes keen. "I'm merely observing. A dreadful business, though. Poor Mr. Pierce." Craddock grunted, turning to the body. The letter opener, ornate and heavy, was no mere desk trinket. It was a statement, much like the man it had silenced. Pierce's reputation as a critic was formidable, his reviews as feared as they were anticipated. Miss Marple recalled Joan mentioning his latest column, which had called Marcel's previous work a tired pastiche. Had that barb struck deeper than anyone knew? She glanced at the suspects, each a study in contrasts. Marcel's nervous energy, Celeste's icy detachment, Lydia's controlled poise, Victor's restless bravado. Someone, she thought, had turned a critic's words into a fatal wound. As the police began their questions, Miss Marple slipped to the side, her small figure unnoticed amid the clamor. She approached a trembling usherette, offering a kind smile and a peppermint from her bag. "My dear," she said softly, "you must have seen such a lot tonight. Did Mr. Pierce seem himself before—" "Well, before?" The girl, grateful for the kindness, nodded. "He was scribbling in his notebook, ma'am, like always. Frowning, he was, and muttering something about a scandal. I didn't hear more, too busy with the guests." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind already weaving the first threads of the mystery. A scandal, a letter opener, a darkened room, each a clue, each a fragment of a pattern yet to emerge. As the palais emptied, its glamour tarnished by death, she retrieved her knitting and resumed her seat, content to watch and wait. The curtain had fallen, but the drama, she knew, was only beginning. Chapter 2. The Critic's Last Words. The Grand Palais, so recently a stage for elegance, now bore the grim air of a crime scene. The chandeliers, dimmed to a mournful glow, cast long shadows over the velvet seats, where only hours before the fashion elite had preened. Now, police constables moved with quiet efficiency, their boots muffled on the plush carpet, while Inspector Craddock stood over the body of Roland Pierce, his notebook open and his expression dour. The silver letter opener, still lodged in the critic's chest, gleamed accusingly under the light, a silent witness to the violence that had shattered the evening. Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively near the back, her knitting needles idle in her lap, observed the scene with the calm detachment of one who had seen death before. Her eyes, sharp behind their spectacles, flickered from face to face, noting the subtle tells of fear, guilt, or calculation among those who remained. Inspector Craddock, wiping his brow with a handkerchief, directed his men to secure the area. The body had not been moved, pending the coroner's arrival, but already the facts were stark. Roland Pierce had been stabbed during the brief blackout that preceded Marcel Duval's show, a blackout that lasted no more than 30 seconds. The letter opener, ornate and heavy, had pierced his heart with surgical precision, suggesting either luck or intent. In Pierce's clenched hand, discovered by a constable, was a crumpled scrap of paper, its ink smudged but legible. "You'll pay for your words." The phrase, menacing in its brevity, hung in the air like a storm cloud, and Craddock's frown deepened as he read it aloud to his sergeant. Miss Marple, invited to stay by Craddock's reluctant courtesy. She was, after all, a known quantity in such matters, listened as he began questioning the 4 chief suspects, each of whom had been near the front row when the lights failed. Marcel Duval, the designer, stood with his arms crossed, his crimson scarf now askew, his thin face pale but defiant. Celeste Varon, the model, leaned against a pillar, her beauty undiminished by the strain in her eyes. Lydia Crane, editor of Vogue Elegance, sat rigidly, her hands clasped tightly, as if to keep her thoughts in check. Victor Hale, Marcel's rival, paced restlessly, his flamboyant coat swinging, his cufflinks catching the light. Each claimed innocence, their alibis a fragile weave of half-truths and corroborations, and Miss Marple's mind, like her knitting, began to form a pattern from the loose threads. Craddock started with Marcel, whose nervous energy seemed to crackle. "I was backstage," Marcel insisted, his French accent sharp with indignation. "The show was about to begin, and I was adjusting a gown's hem. Elise, my assistant, was with me the whole time." Elise, a slight young woman with mousy hair, nodded vigorously, though her hands twisted in her apron. Craddock scribbled a note, his skepticism plain. "And you heard nothing, saw nothing. A man was stabbed not 20 feet from your precious runway." Marcel's eyes flashed. "The blackout was chaos. I was focused on my work. Pierce's death is a tragedy, but it has nothing to do with me." Miss Marple, tilting her head, noted the faint tremor in his voice, the way his fingers clutched the scarf as if it were a lifeline. She recalled Joan's gossip about Pierce's scathing preview of Marcel's collection, a review that could have ended his career before it truly began. Motive, she thought, was as clear as the silk on his models. Next, Craddock turned to Celeste Varon, whose poise was a study in control. Her platinum hair, swept into an elegant chignon, framed a face that could have graced a Renaissance canvas, but her eyes held a guarded edge. "I was in the wings, preparing to walk," she said, her voice low and measured. "The makeup artist, Clara, was touching up my face. I didn't even see Pierce until after." Clara, a nervous girl with smudged mascara, confirmed this, though her hesitation suggested she feared saying more. Craddock pressed. "You and Pierce had a history, didn't you? He called you, what was it, a mannequin with no soul, in his last column." Celeste's lips tightened, but she met his gaze. "His words stung, Inspector, but I don't kill for insults. My career speaks for itself." Miss Marple, watching closely, saw the faint flush on Celeste's cheeks, the way her hands, so graceful on the runway, clenched briefly. She remembered a snippet from Joan. Pierce had hinted at a secret about Celeste, something that could tarnish her star. A woman like Celeste, Miss Marple mused, might kill to protect her image, as carefully crafted as any gown. Lydia Crane was next, her demeanor as crisp as her tailored suit. I was in my seat, row 2, speaking with a photographer, she said, her voice cool. The blackout caught us all off guard. I didn't move until the scream. The photographer, a wiry man named Harris, nodded, though he admitted he'd been distracted by his camera. Craddock raised an eyebrow. Pierce was your magazine's golden goose, wasn't he? His reviews drove sales, but a bad one could sink you. Lydia's smile was thin. Vogue. Elegance thrives on more than one. Man's opinion, Inspector. I had no reason to harm him. Miss Marple, however, recalled the whispers at the Palais tea-room. Lydia's magazine was hemorrhaging advertisers, and Pierce's influence was her lifeline. A single damning review could unravel her empire. Lydia's composure, Miss Marple thought, was a mask, and masks often hid desperation. Victor Hale, the last to be questioned, was a whirlwind of charisma and nerves. I was across the room, charming a buyer from Paris, he said, his grin forced. Ask anyone. They saw me. Several guests confirmed his presence, but Miss Marple noted the cufflink on his sleeve, engraved with a bold VH, identical to a button found near Pierce's body. When Craddock mentioned it, Victor laughed. A coincidence, surely. My designs are everywhere. Yet his eyes darted to the side, and Miss Marple sensed a crack in his bravado. Victor's avant-garde label, Joan had said, was teetering on bankruptcy, and Pierce's latest column had called his work a garish mockery. A man with everything to lose, Miss Marple thought, might risk much. As Craddock dismissed the suspects to await further questioning, Miss Marple slipped away to the Palais tea-room, a haven of clinking china and hushed gossip. She ordered a pot of Earl Grey and settled at a corner table, her knitting resumed as a cover for her thoughts. The tea-room buzzed with speculation, and Miss Marple, with her knack for blending into the background, listened. A waiter, polishing silver, mentioned Pierce's habit of scribbling furiously during shows, his notebook a catalogue of venom and insight. He was at it tonight, the waiter said, muttering about Duval's collection, something about a scandal. Miss Marple's needles paused. A scandal, you say? She asked, her voice mild. The waiter nodded. Didn't hear much, ma'am, but he looked angry. Kept writing, even when the lights dimmed. She thanked him with a smile and a tip, her mind turning. Pierce's notebook, she decided, held the key to his death. She approached Craddock, who was conferring with a constable, and made her request with the gentle insistence that disarmed even his gruff demeanor. His notebook? Craddock said, frowning. What for? Oh, just a fancy, Inspector, she replied, her eyes twinkling. But a critic's words are his legacy, don't you think? They might tell us what someone didn't want said. Grumbling, Craddock retrieved the notebook from an evidence bag and handed it to her, warning her not to tamper with it. Miss Marple, settling into a chair, opened the leather-bound volume with care. Pierce's handwriting was meticulous, each page a tapestry of observations, some cruel, some astute. She flipped to the final entry, written in a hurried scrawl. Duval's designs, uninspired. A scandal looms, the truth will out. The words stopped abruptly, as if interrupted by the blackout, or the blade. Miss Marple closed the notebook, her mind racing. The note in Pierce's hand, "You'll pay for your words," suggested a personal vendetta, but the notebook hinted at something broader, a secret that threatened ruin. Was it Marcel's designs, accused of lacking originality? Celeste's past, hinted at in whispers. Lydia's magazine, teetering on collapse. or Victor's rivalry, fueled by financial desperation. Each suspect, she thought, was a thread in a tangled skein, and the truth lay in how they intertwined. She returned the notebook to Craddock, who was now questioning the lighting technician about the blackout. "A tripped circuit," the technician said, scratching his head. "Could have been an accident, or not. Someone'd have to know the panel, though." Miss Marple's ears pricked up. The panel, she learned, was backstage, accessible to Marcel and his crew, but also to anyone familiar with the Palais's labyrinthine corridors. Celeste, as a frequent model, would know them. Lydia, a regular at such events, might too. Victor, a designer in his own right, could have scouted the venue. The blackout, Miss Marple realized, was no mere happenstance. It was the murderer's cloak. As the tea room emptied, Miss Marple lingered, her tea grown cold. She thought of Saint Mary Mead, where village gossip had taught her the art of reading silences. Here, in the glittering world of fashion, the stakes were higher, but the human heart was the same, prone to pride, fear, and rage. She recalled a long-ago scandal in her village where a harsh word had led to a broken heart and another darker act. Pierce's words, she mused, were his weapon, and someone had turned them against him. She rose, tucking her knitting into her bag, and made her way to the Palais's exit, where the autumn air was sharp with the promise of rain. The suspects had dispersed, but their faces lingered in her mind, each a study in motive and opportunity. Marcel's fear of ruin, Celeste's wounded pride, Lydia's ambition, Victor's desperation. Each could have wielded the letter opener, but only one had. Miss Marple's steps were slow but purposeful, her mind already tracing the next thread in the pattern. The critic's last words, she knew, would lead her to the truth, if only she could read them rightly. Chapter 3. The Designer's Secret. The morning after the murder at the Grand Palais dawned gray and heavy, the London sky a canopy of brooding clouds that mirrored the unease settling over the fashion world. Miss Jane Marple, breakfasting in the modest dining room of her hotel, sipped her tea and scanned the morning papers. The headlines screamed of Roland Pierce's death, each article laced with speculation about the glittering suspects and the shadowy motives behind the critic's demise. Miss Marple, however, paid little heed to the sensationalism. Her mind was occupied with the subtler details, the crumpled note, the scrawled notebook, the fleeting glances of the 4 suspects under Inspector Craddock's scrutiny. Her knitting lay beside her, a half-finished scarf in soft gray wool, its neat stitches a quiet counterpoint to the tangled mystery she was unraveling. She had arranged to visit Marcel Duval's atelier that morning, ostensibly to admire his designs at the invitation of her niece, Joan, who had connections in the fashion world. In truth, Miss Marple sought to observe the designer in his own domain, where the pressures of his craft might reveal what his words concealed. The atelier, tucked in a narrow street off Savile Row, was a hive of activity despite the scandal. Seamstresses bent over tables strewn with silk and taffeta, their needles flashing, while mannequins stood sentinel, draped in half-finished gowns. Marcel himself greeted Miss Marple with a strained smile, his crimson scarf now replaced by a somber black one, though his nervous energy remained. "Miss Marple, an honor," he said, his French accent clipped. "You wish to see my work. A pity it's overshadowed by tragedy." Miss Marple, her eyes gentle but piercing, murmured sympathies, her hands clasped over her tapestry bag. "Such a dreadful thing, Mr. Duval, but your designs, I'm told, are quite remarkable. Might I see where the magic happens?" Marcel, flattered despite his unease, led her through the atelier, pointing out bolts of velvet, sketches pinned to walls, and a gleaming sewing machine he claimed was his muse. Miss Marple nodded, her attention drifting to a glass display case near his desk. It held an array of tools, scissors, thimbles, and a set of ornate letter openers, their silver handles engraved with flourishes. One slot, she noted, was empty, its velvet lining indented as if recently robbed of its occupant. "Oh, how curious," she said, pausing by the case. "These are lovely. Do you use them often?" Marcel's smile faltered, his hand brushing his scarf. "Mere decorations, Miss Marple. I prefer modern tools for correspondence." His voice was smooth, but his eyes darted to the empty slot, and Miss Marple's needles, had they been in hand, would have clicked with satisfaction. The letter opener in Roland Pierce's chest, she recalled, had been silver, ornate, and heavy, much like those in the case. A coincidence, perhaps, but Miss Marple had little faith in coincidences where murder was concerned. As Marcel excused himself to consult with a seamstress, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze falling on Elise, his assistant, who hovered near a cutting table. The young woman, no more than 20, had a pinched look, her fingers twisting a stray thread as if it were her nerves. Miss Marple approached, her manner as warm as a village tea party. "My dear, you must be exhausted, working through such a storm," she said, offering a peppermint from her bag. Elise, startled, accepted it, her eyes wary but grateful for the kindness. "It's been awful, ma'am," Elise admitted, her voice low. "Mr. Duval's been in a state since last night. The show was everything to him." Miss Marple nodded, her tone soothing. "Of course, such pressure. You were with him backstage, weren't you? It must have been hectic with the lights going out." Elise's hands stilled, and a flush crept up her neck. "Yes, ma'am. I was helping with a gown. We didn't see anything." Her words were too quick, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's, and the older woman's mind noted the discrepancy. Marcel's alibi rested on Elise, but her unease suggested a thread that might unravel under gentle tugging. They were interrupted by Marcel's return, his manner brisk. "Miss Marple, would you care to see the sketches for the collection?" he asked, steering her toward a portfolio. As he flipped through pages of flowing gowns and sharp tailoring, Miss Marple murmured appreciations, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She recalled Joan's mention of Pierce's draft review hinted at in his notebook, which accused Marcel's designs of lacking originality. Could the missing letter opener, so conveniently similar to the murder weapon, point to a designer desperate to silence such a critique? And Elise's nervousness, fear of her employer, or something more? Leaving the atelier, Miss Marple strolled to a nearby cafe, where she settled with a pot of tea and her knitting, her mind weaving through the morning's observations. Marcel's atelier was his kingdom, but kingdoms fall when secrets are exposed. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a local tailor, proud to a fault, had hidden a debt that drove him to theft. Pride, she knew, could twist a man's heart as surely as a needle twists thread. Marcel's pride in his work was evident, but so was his fear. Fear of ruin, perhaps, if Pierce's review saw print. She was joined unexpectedly by Inspector Craddock, who had been canvassing the Palais staff. He sat heavily, his notebook bulging with scribbled notes. "Miss Marple," he said, "you've been poking about, haven't you?" "Find anything?" She smiled, her needles clicking. Only impressions, Inspector, but Mr. Duval's atelier is most interesting. Did you know he keeps a collection of letter openers? One seems to be missing. Craddock's eyes narrowed. The murder weapon, you think? We're tracing it, but no luck yet. No fingerprints either. Wiped clean. Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised. A careful killer, then. But tell me, Inspector, have you spoken to Elise, Marcel's assistant? She seems troubled. Craddock frowned, flipping through his notes. She confirmed Duval's alibi, but she was jittery. I'll press her again. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Gently, Inspector. A frightened girl is like a frayed seam. Pull too hard, and it tears. He grunted, accustomed to her cryptic advice, and left to pursue his leads. As the cafe filled with the lunchtime crowd, Miss Marple lingered, her thoughts returning to Elise. The girl's fear was palpable, but was it fear of Marcel, or fear of what she knew? Miss Marple recalled a village girl, years ago, who had lied to protect a cruel employer, only to confess when kindness loosened her tongue. She resolved to speak with Elise again, away from Marcel's shadow. For now, she finished her tea, her scarf growing longer with each stitch, and her mind stitching together the clues. A missing letter opener, a nervous assistant, a designer's pride, and a critic's silenced voice. The pattern was forming, but one thread, Marcel's secret, remained just out of reach. Chapter 4. The Model's Mask. The drizzle that had threatened London all morning finally broke, casting a fine mist over the city as Miss Jane Marple made her way to a discreet cafe in Mayfair. The establishment, favored by the fashion set for its understated elegance, was where Celeste Varon had agreed to meet her, persuaded by a note from Miss Marple's niece Joan, who had framed the request as a friendly chat about the industry. In truth, Miss Marple sought to peel back the layers of Celeste's poised exterior, sensing that the model's icy composure hid a warmth, or a wound, that might illuminate Roland Pierce's murder. Her tapestry bag, heavy with knitting, swung gently at her side, and her eyes, bright despite the gray day, scanned the cafe's interior as she entered. Celeste was already seated, her platinum hair catching the light like a halo, her posture as perfect as if she were still on the runway. She wore a simple yet exquisitely tailored dress, its deep emerald hue accentuating her alabaster skin. To the casual observer, she was the epitome of control, but Miss Marple noted the faint tightness around her mouth, the way her fingers toyed with a silver spoon. Miss Marple, Celeste said, rising with a smile that was more professional than warm. Joan speaks so highly of you. I'm delighted to meet, though I confess I'm puzzled by your interest. Miss Marple settled into the chair opposite, her manner as comforting as a village hearth. My dear, I'm merely an old woman with a fondness for beautiful things, and a curiosity about people. You've had such a trying time with poor Mr. Pierce's death. She opened her bag, retrieving her knitting, and her needles began their soft, rhythmic dance. Celeste's smile flickered, but she nodded. It was dreadful. I still can't believe it happened. The cafe buzzed with the murmur of nearby patrons, their conversations a backdrop of gossip about the Palais tragedy. Miss Marple ordered a pot of Darjeeling, and as the tea arrived, steered the conversation gently. You were to be the star of Mr. Duval's show, weren't you? Such pressure, with all those eyes on you, and Mr. Pierce's pen, so I hear, was not always kind. Celeste's eyes darkened, and she set the spoon down with a faint clink. Roland Pierce, she said, her voice low, had a talent for cruelty. His last review called me a mannequin with no soul. It stung, but I've learned to ignore such things. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her gaze soft but searching. Of course, my dear. Words can wound, but they pass. Though I wonder, did he ever say anything personal to you? Something that cut deeper? Celeste hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of her teacup. He was always probing, hinting at secrets. A week ago, at a fitting, he cornered me and said he knew something that could end my reign. I laughed it off, but her voice trailed away, and Miss Marple noted the flicker of fear in her eyes, quickly masked. The conversation paused as a waitress refilled their pot, and Miss Marple took the opportunity to observe Celeste's hands. They were delicate, the nails perfectly manicured, but the knuckles bore faint calluses, likely from gripping heavy gowns or posing for hours. Could such hands, she wondered, have driven a letter opener with the precision that felled Pierce? She recalled the seamstress at Marcel's atelier, who had overheard a heated exchange between Celeste and Pierce days before the show. He threatened to expose something, the seamstress had whispered, her eyes wide with the thrill of gossip. Miss Marple filed this away, her mind turning to the nature of secrets in a world where image was everything. "Tell me, Miss Varen," she said, her tone as mild as the tea. "Where were you when the lights went out? It must have been so confusing backstage." Celeste's composure held, but her fingers tightened on the cup. "I was in the wings, with Clara, the makeup artist. She was adjusting my powder. Last-minute nerves, you know. I didn't see Pierce or anyone else until the scream." Her alibi, Miss Marple knew, was corroborated, but Clara's hesitation when questioned by Craddock suggested a gap in the story. Had Celeste slipped away in the darkness, or was Clara covering for her own reasons? As they spoke, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to a memory from St. Mary Mead, where a young actress, all charm and ambition, had hidden a scandalous past behind a radiant smile. Celeste, she sensed, was no stranger to masks, her beauty a shield as much as a weapon. "You must be very strong," Miss Marple said, almost to herself, "to carry such expectations, to face such scrutiny." Celeste's laugh was brittle. "Strength is part of the job, Miss Marple. You learn to stand tall, no matter what." But her eyes, for a moment, betrayed a flicker of vulnerability, and Miss Marple's needles paused, sensing a thread worth tugging. Their meeting ended with polite pleasantries, Celeste excusing herself for a photo shoot. As she left, her stride was as confident as ever, but Miss Marple noted the slight hunch of her shoulders, as if carrying an unseen weight. Returning to her hotel, Miss Marple settled in the lounge with her knitting and a fresh pot of tea, her mind weaving through the morning's encounter. Celeste's poise was flawless, but flaws, she knew, lay beneath surfaces. The threat Pierce had made, was it idle cruelty, or did he hold a secret that could shatter Celeste's carefully crafted image? And if so, how far would she go to protect it? Inspector Craddock joined her later, his face etched with the fatigue of a man chasing leads in a world he little understood. "Miss Marple," he said, sinking into a chair, "you've been at it again, haven't you? What did you make of the Varen girl?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking. "A lovely young woman, Inspector, but perhaps not as untroubled as she seems. Did you know Pierce threatened her with some revelation? It might be worth asking that seamstress again. She overheard something at a fitting." Craddock scribbled a note, his expression skeptical but attentive. "And her alibi?" he asked. "Clara's shaky, but it holds, for now." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts returning to the palais. The blackout, so brief yet so convenient, had given someone the cover to strike. Celeste, poised in the wings, could have moved swiftly, her familiarity with the venue an advantage. But motive, Miss Marple thought, was the key. A ruined reputation in Celeste's world was as fatal as a blade, and Pierce's hints at a scandal suggested a wound deeper than a bad review. She recalled the crumpled note in Pierce's hand. "You'll pay for your words," and wondered if it was meant for Celeste, whose career hung on her untarnished image. As the rain pattered against the hotel windows, Miss Marple's scarf grew longer, its stitches as steady as her resolve. Celeste's mask was intact, but masks, she knew, could slip. The truth lay in what lay beneath, fear, shame, or rage, and Miss Marple was determined to find it, one gentle question at a time. Chapter 5. The Editor's Ambition. The London evening was sharp with the chill of autumn, the streets aglow with the soft haze of lamplights, as Miss Jane Marple made her way to a charity gala at the Savoy. The event, a glittering affair hosted by Vogue Elegance, was the perfect setting to observe Lydia Crane, the magazine's formidable editor, in her element. Miss Marple, dressed in a modest black dress with a lace shawl, carried her tapestry bag, her knitting tucked inside as a quiet companion. Her invitation, secured through Joan's connections, was a pretext. Her true purpose was to study Lydia, whose steely demeanor at the Grand Palais had hinted at depths unplumbed by Inspector Craddock's blunt questioning. As she entered the grand ballroom, where champagne flutes clinked and gowns shimmered, Miss Marple's mild eyes took in the scene, alert for the undercurrents that swirled beneath the surface. Lydia Crane stood at the center of the room, a vision of authority in a tailored burgundy gown, her dark hair swept into a severe chignon. She greeted guests with a smile that was both gracious and guarded, her handshake firm, her gaze assessing. Miss Marple, blending into the crowd with the ease of a village spinster, noted the deference paid to Lydia by advertisers and designers alike, yet also the whispers that followed her, murmurs of a magazine teetering on the edge of financial ruin. Roland Pierce's influence, Miss Marple recalled from Joan's gossip, had been Lydia's lifeline, his reviews drawing readers and advertisers to Vogue Elegance. A single misstep from him could unravel her empire, and his death, so brutally timed, raised questions that lingered like the scent of expensive perfume. Miss Marple found a quiet corner near a potted palm, her knitting retrieved as a shield for her observations. She watched as Lydia moved through the crowd, her conversation with a wealthy sponsor clipped but polite, her laughter a touch too bright. During a lull, Miss Marple approached, her manner disarming. "Miss Crane, what a splendid evening," she said, her voice warm. "You must be so proud of your work, though I imagine it's been a trying time, with poor Mr. Pierce's tragedy." Lydia's smile tightened, but she nodded. "Thank you, Miss Marple. It's been a shock, of course, but we carry on. The magazine must endure." Her words were smooth, yet Miss Marple caught the flicker of strain in her eyes, the way her fingers gripped her clutch. "Of course," Miss Marple murmured. "Your magazine is such a force, thanks to voices like Mr. Pierce's. His loss must be keenly felt." Lydia's expression hardened for a fraction of a second, then softened into practiced regret. He was invaluable, yes, a critic of rare insight. As they spoke, Miss Marple recalled a snippet from the Palais tea room. Lydia's magazine was losing advertisers, its glossy pages sustained by Pierce's reputation. A bad review from him, or a shift in his favor to a rival publication, could spell disaster. She probed gently, her needles clicking softly. "I suppose you saw much of him, planning features and such. Were you with him before the show?" Lydia's gaze sharpened, but she answered evenly. "I was in my seat, row 2, chatting with Harris, the photographer. The blackout caught us unawares. I didn't move until the scream." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the alibi, which Harris had confirmed, though with a distracted air. She changed tack, her tone light. "Such a busy life you lead, my dear. I overheard someone mention you stepped away briefly before the show. To fetch a program, perhaps?" Lydia's hand stilled on her clutch, her smile unwavering, but her eyes narrowing. "A program, yes. I wanted to check the order of the designs. A small thing, hardly worth noting." But Miss Marple's gentle smile hid a keen awareness. Lydia's absence, however brief, coincided with the blackout, and the side door near the front row was close to her seat. Their conversation was interrupted by a young assistant, breathless and apologetic, who whispered to Lydia about a phone call. Lydia excused herself, and Miss Marple, pretending to focus on her knitting, overheard a fragment of Lydia's hushed words as she stepped away. "It's under control. The magazine's future is secure now." The tone was urgent, almost desperate, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning over the phrase. Secure now? Because Pierce was gone? She thought of a saint. Mary Mead widow, ambitious and proud, who had schemed to protect her status, only to be undone by a careless word. Ambition, Miss Marple knew, could drive a woman to desperate acts, and Lydia's ambition was as sharp as the letter opener that had ended Pierce's life. Later, at the gala's buffet, Miss Marple struck up a conversation with Lydia's assistant, a nervous young woman named Margaret, whose glasses slipped down her nose as she spoke. Offering a sympathetic ear and a peppermint, Miss Marple drew her out. "It must be so demanding, working for Miss Crane," she said. "All those deadlines, and now this dreadful business." Margaret nodded, her voice low. "It's been awful, ma'am. Miss Crane's been under such pressure, advertisers pulling out, and Mr. Pierce, well, he was difficult. She relied on him, but they argued sometimes." "Argued?" Miss Marple's tone was all curiosity, her eyes soft. Margaret hesitated, then whispered, "Last week, I heard them in her office. He was threatening to back another magazine unless she... Well, I didn't catch it all, but she was furious." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind weaving this new thread into the pattern. A threat from Pierce, a magazine in peril. Lydia's motive was as clear as the crystal chandeliers overhead, but opportunity remained elusive. As the gala wound down, Miss Marple slipped away, her shawl drawn against the evening chill. She walked back to her hotel, the city's lights reflecting on wet pavements, her thoughts circling Lydia Crane. The editor's alibi was solid, yet the brief absence to fetch a program placed her near the side door during the blackout. The letter opener, wiped clean of fingerprints, suggested a calculated mind, and Lydia's was as sharp as any. Miss Marple recalled the note in Pierce's hand. "You'll pay for your words," and wondered if it was Lydia's ambition, not Marcel's pride or Celeste's fear, that had driven the blade. Settling in her hotel room, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the gray scarf lengthening with each stitch. She thought of Inspector Craddock, who would no doubt grumble at her meddling, but she resolved to share her findings. Lydia's ambition, she sensed, was a thread that ran deep, woven with fear of failure and the need for control. Whether it led to murder remained to be seen, but Miss Marple was certain of one thing: the truth, like a well-tailored gown, would reveal itself when the seams were carefully examined. Chapter 6. The Rivals. Grudge. The London fog curled through the streets like a whispered secret, cloaking the city in a veil of mystery as Miss Jane Marple made her way to Victor Hale's studio in Shoreditch. The district, alive with the pulse of artists and dreamers, suited the flamboyant designer whose avant-garde creations had sparked both admiration and derision. Miss Marple, her tapestry bag swinging gently, had secured an invitation through a mutual acquaintance of her niece, Joan, under the guise of admiring Victor's bold designs. In truth, she sought to unravel the threads of his rivalry with Marcel Duval and his enmity toward Roland Pierce, whose scathing pen had threatened to unravel Victor's precarious career. Her shawl, pinned neatly at her shoulder, did little to ward off the damp chill, but her eyes, bright and unyielding, missed nothing as she navigated the cobbled lane to his studio. The space was a riot of color and chaos, its walls plastered with sketches of daring silhouettes, jackets with jagged hems, gowns that seemed to defy gravity. Bolts of neon fabric spilled across tables, and a gramophone played a jazzy tune, its notes clashing with the clatter of sewing machines. Victor greeted her with a theatrical flourish, his coat a patchwork of velvet and brocade, his cufflinks engraved with a bold VH, glinting as he waved her in. "Miss Marple, a delight," he exclaimed, his voice booming. "Come to see where genius takes flight? Mind the pins." His grin was wide, but Miss Marple noted the strain in his eyes, the way his laughter carried a brittle edge, like glass about to crack. She murmured appreciation for the vibrant chaos, settling into a chair he offered, her knitting emerging from her bag as a familiar prop. "Your work is so fearless, Mr. Hale," she said, her tone warm but probing. "It must be trying, though, with critics like Mr. Pierce casting such harsh judgments." Victor's smile faltered, his hand brushing a cufflink. "Pierce," he said, his voice dropping, "had no vision. He called my last collection garish nonsense. Nonsense! The man wouldn't know art if it danced before him." His bitterness was palpable, and Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, marking the rhythm of her thoughts. She recalled the button found near Pierce's body at the Grand Palais, its VH engraving a twin to Victor's cufflinks. Inspector Craddock had noted it as a possible clue, though Victor had dismissed it as a coincidence when questioned. Miss Marple, however, was skeptical of such conveniences. "It must be discouraging," she said, her eyes gentle, "to pour your heart into your work, only to face such criticism. I heard your label has faced challenges?" Victor's jaw tightened, but he shrugged with forced nonchalance. "The fashion world is a battlefield, Miss Marple. My label's holding its own, despite Pierce's poison pen." As he showed her a series of sketches, wild, angular designs, that seemed to defy convention, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the night of the murder. "You were at the Palais, weren't you? So dreadful, that blackout. Where were you when it happened?" Victor's grin returned, but it was strained. "Across the room, charming a Parisian buyer. Half a dozen people saw me. Ask them. I was nowhere near Pierce." His alibi, Miss Marple knew, was solid, corroborated by witnesses, Yet the button nagged at her, a loose thread in an otherwise tidy story. They were interrupted by a young intern, a lanky boy with ink-stained fingers, who brought Victor a stack of fabric samples. As Victor inspected them, Miss Marple seized the moment to speak with the intern, offering a peppermint and a smile. "You must be so proud, working for Mr. Hale," she said, her voice soft as a village breeze. The boy, flustered but eager, nodded. "It's exciting, ma'am, but, well, it's tough. The studio's behind on bills, and Mr. Hale's been frantic since Pierce's last review. Said it could bankrupt us." His words spilled out, and he glanced nervously at Victor, who was engrossed in the samples. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind weaving this revelation into the pattern. Victor's financial desperation, fueled by Pierce's venom, was a motive as vivid as his designs. Returning to Victor, Miss Marple admired a particularly audacious gown, its fabric shimmering like liquid fire. "Such passion in your work," she said. "It reminds me of a young painter in my village, so determined to prove himself. He took risks, but risks can lead to mistakes." Victor's eyes narrowed, but he laughed. "Mistakes? I thrive on risk, Miss Marple. Pierce's death was a shock, but it changes nothing for me." Yet his hand strayed to his cufflink again, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, a tell as clear as a dropped stitch. Leaving the studio, she walked through the fog to a nearby tea shop, where she settled with a pot of assam and her knitting. The intern's words echoed, bankruptcy loomed for Victor, and Pierce's review had been a death knell. The button, so like his cufflinks, suggested proximity to the crime, yet his alibi held firm. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead grocer, whose rivalry with a competitor had led to sabotage, his guilt betrayed by a careless detail. Victor's bravado, she sensed, masked a fear that ran deep, and the button was a clue that refused to be dismissed. Inspector Craddock found her there, his coat damp from the fog, his expression a mix of exasperation and curiosity. "Miss Marple," he said, pulling up a chair. "You've been to Hale's studio, haven't you? Find anything?" She smiled, her needles clicking. "Only impressions, Inspector, but that button near Mr. Pierce's body, has it been traced? It's remarkably like Mr. Hale's cufflinks." Craddock frowned, flipping through his notebook. "We're looking into it. Hale swears it's not his and his. Witnesses place him across the room, but I'll have another look at that button." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the blackout. Victor's familiarity with the Palais, as a frequent designer there, gave him knowledge of its layout, perhaps even the lighting panel. The button suggested he'd been closer to Pierce than he claimed, but how? A dropped accessory or a deliberate plant? She recalled the note in Pierce's hand, "You'll pay for your words," and wondered if Victor's grudge, fueled by financial ruin, had driven him to silence the critic for good. As the tea shop filled with the chatter of artists and locals, Miss Marple's scarf grew longer, its stitches a mirror of her steady resolve. Victor Hale's rivalry with Marcel and his hatred of Pierce were threads in a darkening tapestry, but the truth remained elusive. Was the button a careless mistake or a clue to a cunning act? She resolved to watch Victor closely, certain that his flamboyant mask hid a grudge that might yet unravel into guilt. Chapter 7. Threads of Evidence. The London air was thick with the damp of late autumn, the streets slick with fallen leaves, as Miss Jane Marple sat in the quiet of her hotel room, her knitting a steady companion. The gray scarf, now nearly complete, lay across her lap, its neat stitches a testament to her patience, a patience that extended to the unraveling of Roland Pierce's murder. The Grand Palais tragedy had woven a complex tapestry of motives and alibis, each suspect a thread knotted with ambition, fear, or rage. Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as her needles, turned over the clues: the silver letter opener, the crumpled note, the blackout, and the button that pointed to Victor Hale. Yet the pattern remained incomplete, and she knew the truth lay in the smallest details, those overlooked by less discerning eyes. Inspector Craddock had shared new findings that morning, his visit to the hotel marked by his usual blend of gruff respect and impatience. Over a pot of tea in the lounge, he had laid out the forensic report with a sigh. The letter opener was wiped clean. No fingerprints, not even a smudge, he said, rubbing his temple. And the blackout was no accident. The lighting panel was tampered with, a circuit deliberately tripped. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes bright with interest. "And the button, Inspector? The one with Mr. Hale's initials?" Craddock flipped through his notebook. "Still checking. It matches Hale's cufflinks, but he insists he lost none that night. His alibi's solid, witnesses galore. We're tracing the button's origin, but it's slow work." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the Palais's layout. She had requested a floor plan from Craddock, who had obliged with a raised eyebrow, and now she spread it across the table, her finger tracing the front row where Pierce had died. A side door, discreetly, tucked near the stage, caught her eye. It led to the backstage area, where Marcel Duval and his crew had been, but also to a corridor accessible from the audience. "This door," she said, almost to herself. "Could someone have slipped through it in the dark?" Craddock frowned, leaning over the plan. "Possible. It's close to Pierce's seat, and the blackout gave cover. But it'd take someone who knew the Palais well, Duval, maybe, or Varon. Even Crane or Hale could have scouted it." Miss Marple's smile was gentle but knowing. "Knowledge is power, Inspector, and in a place like the Palais, it's opportunity." Craddock grunted, jotting a note to recheck the door's access, and left to pursue his leads, muttering about her cryptic ways. Determined to test her theory, Miss Marple visited the Grand Palais that afternoon, her shawl drawn against the chill. The venue, emptied of its glamour, felt cavernous, its velvet seats silent witnesses to the crime. A caretaker, grumbling but obliging, let her in, and she paced the aisle near the front row, her steps slow and deliberate. The side door, painted to blend with the wall, was unlocked, its hinges well-oiled. She pushed it open, finding a narrow corridor that branched to the backstage and the lighting panel. 30 seconds, she thought, the duration of the blackout, was time enough for a swift, determined hand to strike and retreat. She lingered by the panel where a young technician was repairing a fuse. Offering a peppermint and a smile, she drew him into conversation. "Such a terrible night," she said, her voice soft. "You must have been frantic when the lights failed." The technician, a wiry lad named Tom, nodded. "It was chaos, ma'am. I was at the panel, checking wires when it tripped. Saw a figure slip out the side door just before. Dark coat, couldn't see the face." Miss Marple's needles, had they been in hand, would have danced. "A dark coat, you say? How interesting." Tom shrugged, unaware of the weight of his words. "Could have been anyone. Lots of folks wear coats like that." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. Marcel Duval often wore a dark overcoat, as did Celeste Varon for her entrances. Lydia Crane had been seen in a similar one at the gala, and Victor Hale's flamboyant style didn't preclude a practical garment. The coat, like the button, was a clue that refused to align neatly with one suspect, yet it narrowed the field. She recalled a saint. Mary Mead incident, where a stolen coat had misled the village constable, only to reveal the thief's identity through a torn lining. Details, she thought, were the stitches that held a case together. Returning to her hotel, she settled in the lounge with a fresh pot of tea, her knitting resuming its rhythm. The clues were mounting. The letter opener, likely from Marcel's atelier. The note in Pierce's hand, hinting at vengeance. The button, pointing to Victor. And now the dark coat, seen near the side door. The blackout, she realized, was the key, its deliberate nature suggesting a plan as precise as a tailor's cut. Whoever had tripped the circuit knew the Palay's workings, and each suspect, Marcel with his backstage access, Celeste with her runway familiarity, Lydia with her editor's presence at countless shows, Victor with his designer's reconnaissance, had the means. As she knitted, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to motive. Pierce's notebook, with its cryptic scandal looms, suggested a secret that threatened ruin. Marcel's designs, accused of being uninspired, faced exposure. Celeste's past, hinted at in Pierce's threats, could shatter her career. Lydia's magazine, teetering on collapse, depended on Pierce's favor. Victor's label, drowning in debt, could not survive another blow. Each had reason to silence the critic, but only one had seized the moment, cloaked in darkness. A knock at the lounge door heralded Joan, her niece, who breezed in with news from the fashion world. "Aunt Jane, it's all anyone talks about, Pierce's murder, and who might have done it. They say Victor Hale was in a rage after Pierce's last review, and Lydia Crane's been making calls to advertisers, promising stability. It's like a play, isn't it?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles steady. "Indeed, my dear, but every play has its climax, and we're not there yet." Joan laughed, unaware of the depth in her aunt's words, and left to attend a gallery opening. Alone. Again, Miss Marple considered her next move. The side door and the dark coat were threads that needed tracing, and the suspect's alibis, though solid, bore scrutiny. She resolved to speak with Craddock about the technician's sighting, and perhaps to revisit Elise, Marcel's assistant, whose nervous demeanor hinted at knowledge unspoken. The truth, she knew, was like a seam. Pull the right thread, and the whole fabric would unravel. As the fog thickened outside, Miss Marple's scarf neared completion, its final stitches a promise of resolution. The Palais murder was a puzzle of human passions, pride, fear, ambition, and she was determined to piece it together, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 8. The Hidden Motive. The soft glow of a single lamp illuminated Miss Jane Marple's hotel room, casting delicate shadows across the walls as she sat with her knitting, the gray scarf now a near-finished testament to her quiet persistence. The London evening was hushed, the city's clamor muted by the thick curtains drawn against the autumn chill. Her mind, however, was far from still, weaving through the threads of Roland Pierce's murder with the same care she applied to her stitches. The clues, the silver letter opener, the crumpled note, the button, the dark coat, the deliberate blackout, formed a pattern, but its heart remained elusive. Each suspect, Marcel Duval, Celeste Varon, Lydia Crane, Victor Hale, carried a motive as vivid as the fabrics they championed, Yet Miss Marple knew that murder often sprang from a deeper, hidden wound. Tonight, she sought that wound, the motive that had turned a critic's words into a fatal strike. Over dinner with her niece, Joan, whose chatter about art and fashion filled the hotel dining room with a lively hum, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to human nature. People kill for love, money, or fear. She mused aloud, her voice soft as she sipped her soup. Joan, slicing into her roast, laughed. "Aunt Jane, you make it sound so simple. But this murder, it's like something out of a novel, isn't it? All those glamorous suspects, and Pierce's awful reviews." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but she said nothing, her mind recalling a St. Mary Mead scandal, where a quiet grocer's fear of exposure had led to a desperate act. Fear, she thought, was often the strongest thread, pulling tighter than pride or greed. The key, she suspected, lay in Pierce's notebook, its final entry. Duval's designs, uninspired. A scandal looms, hinting at a revelation that could ruin more than a reputation. She had asked Inspector Craddock to retrieve Pierce's unpublished articles, hoping they might clarify the scandal he had hinted at. Craddock, ever skeptical but grudgingly compliant, had delivered a folder that morning, its contents a treasure trove of the critic's sharp prose. Settling at her desk after dinner, Miss Marple opened the folder, her spectacles perched low, and began to read. Most of the drafts were reviews, biting critiques of recent shows, but one stood out, an unfinished piece titled "Theft in Taffeta, Duval's Deception." The article accused Marcel Duval of plagiarizing designs from his late mentor, a reclusive couturier named Etienne Moreau, whose work had faded into obscurity after his death a decade ago. Pierce claimed to have uncovered sketches in an archive that matched Marcel's latest collection, down to the stitching patterns. "Duval's genius," Pierce wrote, "is a mirage built on stolen threads. The fashion world deserves the truth." The article stopped abruptly, as if Pierce had been interrupted, but its implications were explosive. If published, it would destroy Marcel's career, branding him a fraud before his star could fully rise. Miss Marple's needles, had they been in hand, would have paused. Here was a motive as sharp as the letter opener that had silenced the critic. She leaned back, her mind tracing the implications. Marcel's pride, so evident in his atelier, would not survive such an accusation. His nervous energy, his reliance on Elise's shaky alibi, the missing letter opener from his display case, all pointed to a man desperate to protect his legacy. But was he alone in his fear? Celeste, Lydia, and Victor each had their own secrets, their own reasons to dread Pierce's pen. Could the scandal touch them too, or was it Marcel's burden alone? Miss Marple resolved to test the suspects, to watch their faces when confronted with Pierce's accusation. The next day, she arranged a tea at her hotel, inviting Marcel, Celeste, Lydia, and Victor, under the pretense of discussing the Palais tragedy's impact on the fashion world. Joan, delighted by the intrigue, helped organize the gathering, her connections ensuring their attendance. The hotel's tea room, with its chintz curtains and polished silver, was a cozy contrast to the Palais's grandeur, and Miss Marple, seated at a round table with her knitting in her lap, greeted each guest with her usual warmth. Marcel arrived first, his dark coat draped over his arm, his eyes wary. Celeste followed, her elegance tempered by a faint tension in her posture. Lydia, in a crisp navy suit, was all business, her smile thin. Victor swept in last, his coat a riot of patterns, his laughter loud but hollow. As the tea was poured, Miss Marple steered the conversation to Pierce, her tone gentle. Chapter 9. The Trap is Set. The London afternoon was cloaked in a persistent drizzle, the kind that seeped into one's bones and blurred the edges of the city's grandeur. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the weather, sat in the tea-room of her hotel, her knitting a steady presence as she reviewed her notes on Roland Pierce's murder. The gray scarf, now nearly complete, draped across her lap like a map of her thoughts, each stitch a step closer to the truth. The clues, the silver letter opener, the crumpled note, the engraved button, the dark coat, the deliberate blackout, had woven a tapestry of suspicion around Marcel Duval, Celeste Varon, Lydia Crane, and Victor Hale. Yet the heart of the motive, revealed in Pierce's unpublished article accusing Marcel of plagiarism, pointed most sharply to the designer. Miss Marple, however, knew better than to trust a single thread. The truth required testing, and she had a plan to do just that. Over breakfast, she had proposed to Inspector Craddock a reenactment of the blackout at the Grand Palais, a suggestion he met with his usual mix of skepticism and grudging respect. "A reenactment?" he had said, his brow furrowing. "What's that going to prove, Miss Marple? We've got alibis, witnesses, and not much else." She had smiled, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Sometimes, Inspector, seeing a thing again shows what was missed the first time. People move differently when they think they're watched." Reluctantly, Craddock agreed, arranging for the suspects to gather at the Palais that evening, under the pretense of clarifying their statements. Miss Marple, invited as an observer, knew the real purpose: to set a trap, subtle as a dropped stitch, that might reveal the killer's hand. The Grand Palais, stripped of its earlier glamour, stood somber under the rain-soaked sky. Its chandeliers were dimmed, casting long shadows across the velvet seats, and the stage, bare of models, seemed to mourn the lost spectacle. Marcel, Celeste, Lydia, and Victor arrived, each betraying a flicker of unease as they took their places. Marcel near the stage, Celeste in the wings, Lydia in the second row, Victor across the room. Craddock, flanked by 2 constables, explained the procedure. The lights would dim for 30 seconds, mimicking the blackout, and each was to remain where they stood, as they claimed to have done on the night of the murder. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively in the 3rd row, her knitting in her lap, watched with the keenness of a hawk, her mild demeanor a mask for her scrutiny. As the lights flickered and died, plunging the Palais into darkness, the air grew taut with anticipation. Miss Marple's ears strained for every sound: the rustle of fabric, the creak of a floorboard, the soft intake of breath. 30 seconds passed, a heartbeat in time, yet long enough for a practiced hand to move with purpose. When the lights returned, she noted the subtle shifts. Marcel stood closer to the side door, his crimson scarf caught on a chair's edge, as if he had moved and retreated. Celeste, in the wings, seemed too still, her posture rehearsed, her hands clenched. Lydia, in her seat, gripped her handbag, her knuckles white. Victor, across the room, adjusted his cufflinks, their VH engravings glinting, his eyes darting to the front row where Pierce had died. Craddock, scanning the room, called for observations, but the suspects remained silent, their faces a study in guarded composure. Miss Marple, rising with a polite cough, drew his attention to the scarf on Marcel's chair. "How curious," she said, her voice soft. "It seems Mr. Duval moved closer to the door than he intended." Marcel flushed, muttering about adjusting his stance, but his unease was palpable. Craddock, noting this, moved on, but Miss Marple's mind was alight. The reenactment had confirmed the side door's role. Its proximity to Pierce's seat made it the killer's likely path, but it also revealed Marcel's instinct to drift toward it, a movement too natural to be coincidence. After the reenactment, as the suspects dispersed into the rainy evening, Miss Marple lingered, her thoughts turning to Elise, Marcel's assistant, whose nervous demeanor had lingered in her mind since their meeting at the atelier. Elise's alibi for Marcel, so quick and fervent, had cracked under gentle probing, and Miss Marple suspected the girl held the key to unraveling the designer's secret. She arranged to meet Elise at a quiet cafe near the atelier, away from Marcel's watchful eye, under the guise of discussing a knitting pattern. The cafe, with its steamed windows and clinking cups, was a haven from the drizzle, and Elise, arriving in a worn coat, seemed relieved to see Miss Marple's kind face. Over tea and scones, Miss Marple's gentle questions wove a net of trust. "My dear," she said, offering a peppermint, "you must be so tired, working through such a storm. Mr. Duval relies on you so much, doesn't he?" Elise nodded, her fingers twisting a napkin. "He's brilliant, ma'am, but it's been hard. Since Mr. Pierce died, he's been worse, snapping, pacing, like he's afraid." Miss Marple's needles, had they been in hand, would have clicked with satisfaction. "Afraid, you say? Of the police, perhaps, or something else?" Elise hesitated, her eyes darting to the door, then whispered, "He made me lie, ma'am. That night, he wasn't with me the whole time. He slipped out during the blackout, said he needed air. I didn't see where he went, but he was gone when the lights came back." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. "How brave of you to tell me, my dear. And the letter opener, do you know where it came from?" Elise's hands trembled, and she nodded. "It was from his display case. I noticed it missing that morning before the show. He said it was misplaced, but—" Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind stitching the confession into place. Marcel's absence, the missing letter opener, the side door, all aligned with Pierce's murder, driven by the fear of a plagiarism scandal that could end his career. She thanked Elise, urging her to speak to Craddock, and returned to her hotel, the rain now a steady patter. Settling with her knitting, she reflected on the reenactment and Elise's words. Marcel's movement toward the side door, his assistant's confession, and the letter opener's origin pointed to a man cornered by his own ambition. Yet Miss Marple knew better than to close the case prematurely. Celeste's guarded fear, Lydia's ambition, and Victor's grudge still lingered, threads that might yet twist the pattern. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead Gardner, whose lie to protect a friend had unraveled under kindness, and knew Elise's truth was the turning point. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple's scarf neared its final stitch, a symbol of the case's nearing resolution. The trap had been set, and Marcel's slip had tightened the noose, but she would wait for Craddock's confirmation, for the final thread to be pulled. The truth, she knew, was like a well-knit garment, complete only when every stitch was secure. Chapter 10. The Designer's Confession. The rain had ceased, leaving London's streets glistening under the pale glow of street lamps, as Miss Jane Marple sat in the austere office of Inspector Craddock at Scotland Yard. The room, with its utilitarian desk and stacks of files, was a stark contrast to the opulence of the Grand Palais, yet it suited the gravity of the moment. Her tapestry bag rested at her feet, her knitting momentarily set aside, the gray scarf now complete and folded neatly within. The clues, Roland Pierce's crumpled note, the silver letter opener, the engraved button, the dark coat, the deliberate blackout, and Elise's trembling confession, had woven a tapestry that pointed inexorably to Marcel Duval. Miss Marple, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles, had come to witness the final unraveling, her gentle insistence ensuring she was present when Craddock confronted the designer. Marcel sat across from Craddock, his thin frame hunched, his crimson scarf replaced by a somber gray one that seemed to mirror his pallor. The atelier's vibrancy was absent here. His hands, usually so deft with needle and thread, fidgeted in his lap, betraying a nervousness that bordered on panic. Craddock, his notebook open, leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "Mr. Duval, we've new information. Your assistant, Elise, has retracted her statement. She says you left her side during the blackout. Care to explain?" Marcel's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing his face before he masked it with a forced laugh. "Elise is mistaken. She's young, nervous, confused by the chaos. I was backstage, as I said." Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner, observed the exchange, her presence almost forgotten by Marcel. She noted the sweat beading on his brow, the way his fingers clutched the edge of his chair. Craddock pressed on, his tone unrelenting. "And the letter opener, Mr. Duval? It matches the one missing from your atelier's display case. No fingerprints, but it's a curious coincidence, don't you think?" Marcel's laugh faltered, his voice rising. "A coincidence, yes. Anyone could have taken it. I told you, it was misplaced before the show." Craddock leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "And then there's the matter of Pierce's article. We found a draft accusing you of plagiarizing Etienne Moreau's designs. A scandal like that would ruin you, wouldn't it?" Marcel's face drained of color, his hands trembling visibly now. "Lies," he whispered, but the word lacked conviction. Miss Marple's voice, soft as a village breeze, cut through the tension. "Mr. Duval, you were so proud of your collection. To have it called stolen, it must have been unbearable." Her tone was kind, almost pitying, and Marcel's gaze snapped to her, his composure cracking. "I didn't," he began, then stopped, his shoulders sagging. Craddock seized the moment, his voice low but insistent. "Elise says you slipped out during the blackout, near the side door by Pierce's seat. You knew the Palais layout, didn't you? 30 seconds was enough to strike." Marcel's eyes darted between Craddock and Miss Marple, a trapped animal seeking escape. "I needed air," he muttered. "I was overwhelmed, but I didn't kill him." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression gentle but unyielding. "Mr. Duval, a young man in my village once hid a truth to save his pride. It ate at him until he confessed. The truth is lighter than you think." Her words, simple yet piercing, seemed to unravel the last of Marcel's defenses. He buried his face in his hands, a sob breaking free. "He'd ruin me," he whispered. "Pierce knew about Moreau's sketches. I found them years ago, in an old trunk. They inspired me, gave me a start. I didn't steal, I honored him. But Pierce called it theft. His article would have ended me." Craddock's pen paused, his eyes sharp. "So you stabbed him?" Marcel's head jerked up, his voice raw. "It wasn't planned. I saw him that night, scribbling in his notebook, smirking. I took the letter opener from my case, thought I'd confront him, make him listen. The blackout. It just happened. I moved through the side door, and before I knew it, he trailed off, tears streaming down his face. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to stop. Miss Marple's expression softened, though her eyes held no surprise. She had seen it before in St. Mary Mead, a moment of rage, born of fear, that turned a man's hand to violence. Marcel's confession, wrung from him by guilt and her gentle prodding, was the final stitch in the pattern. Craddock signaled a constable, who stepped forward with handcuffs, and Marcel offered no resistance, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I'm sorry," he whispered, to no one in particular, as he was led away. As the office emptied, Craddock turned to Miss Marple, his exasperation tempered by admiration. "You knew, didn't you? That reenactment, Elise's confession, you set it all up." She smiled, retrieving her knitting bag. "I merely pulled a thread, Inspector. People are like fabric. Under pressure, they fray." Craddock shook his head, muttering about her methods, but promised to send her a report for her curiosity. Back in her hotel room, Miss Marple settled with a cup of tea, her thoughts lingering on the case. Marcel's motive, fear of ruin, pride in his work, had driven him to a desperate act, but the others were not blameless. Celeste's fear, Lydia's ambition, Victor's grudge, each had danced on the edge of suspicion, their secrets exposed by the case's unraveling. She thought of Pierce's note. "You'll pay for your words," and saw it now as Marcel's cry of desperation, a warning turned to reality. The scarf, complete at last, lay across her chair, its stitches a quiet record of her work. The truth had been found, but Miss Marple felt no triumph, only a gentle sadness for the frailty of human hearts. She packed her bag, ready to return to St. Mary Mead, where simpler mysteries awaited, though none, she knew, were ever truly simple. Chapter 11. The Palais Restored. The London sky had cleared to a pale, tentative blue, as if the city itself exhaled after the storm of Roland Pierce's murder. The Grand Palais, its grandeur undimmed by tragedy, was once again a beacon of fashion, its chandeliers sparkling as preparations resumed for the season's remaining shows. Miss Jane Marple, back in the quiet of her St. Mary Mead cottage, sat by her window, her knitting needles idle for the moment, the completed gray scarf draped over a chair like a quiet trophy. The newspapers, spread across her table, buzzed with the aftermath of Marcel Duval's arrest, their headlines a mix of shock and fascination. Designer's deadly secret, plagiarism and murder at the Palais. Yet Miss Marple, sipping her morning tea, felt only a gentle melancholy, her thoughts lingering on the human frailties that had unraveled so violently in that glittering hall. Inspector Craddock had visited her the previous evening, his sturdy frame filling her small parlor, his expression a blend of gratitude and exasperation. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he said, setting his hat on the table. "Marcel Duval's confessed, and the evidence, letter opener, Elise's statement, the side door, lines up neatly. But I'll never understand how you see these things." She had smiled, offering him a slice of seed cake. "It's only observation, Inspector. People are much the same, whether in a village or a palace. They hide their fears, but fears have a way of showing through." Craddock had shared the final details. Marcel's trial was set, his motive laid bare by Pierce's unpublished article, which had threatened to expose his reliance on Etienne Moreau's designs. The letter opener, traced to Marcel's atelier, bore no fingerprints but matched the set in his display case. Elise's confession, spurred by Miss Marple's gentle probing, had sealed the case. Her account of Marcel's absence during the blackout, corroborated by the technician's sighting of a figure in a dark coat. The button with VH initials, initially pointing to Victor Hale, was deemed a red herring, likely dropped by a guest wearing one of Victor's designs. Craddock, though loath to admit it, credited Miss Marple's reenactment for prompting Elise's truth, the trap that had caught Marcel's guilt. As she sipped her tea, Miss Marple reflected on the other suspects, their lives altered by the case's ripple effects. Celeste Varon, her poise intact, had returned to the runway, but whispers of Pierce's hinted scandal, a youthful indiscretion perhaps, followed her, a shadow on her star. Lydia Crane, her magazine teetering, had secured a new investor, her ambition undeterred but her reputation bruised by her reliance on Pierce. Victor Hale, his label still struggling, had gained a perverse fame from the case, his designs now the talk of London, though his grudge against Pierce lingered in bitter asides. Each, Miss Marple thought, had faced a reckoning, their secrets laid bare in the Palais's harsh light. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead, widow, whose pride had led to a lie that unraveled her life, and saw echoes in Marcel's desperate act. "Fashion," she murmured to her cat, Pearl, who blinked from the window-sill, "is like village life. Beautiful surfaces hide dark secrets." The Palais, now restored to its purpose, would host new shows, new dramas, but the stain of murder, she knew, would linger in its velvet folds. Craddock had left her with a copy of Pierce's final published review, printed posthumously in Vogue Elegance. Curious, she opened it, her eyes scanning the critic's sharp prose. To her surprise, it praised Marcel's collection, calling it a bold evolution, rooted in tradition yet daringly fresh. The plagiarism accusation was absent, as if Pierce had reconsidered his draft. Had Marcel's fear been for naught? Or had Pierce, in his final moments, seen something in the designs that softened his judgment? Miss Marple set the paper down, her mind turning to the fragility of pride, the weight of a single word. As the morning sun warmed her cottage, she resumed her knitting, starting a new project, a pair of mittens for Joan. The Palais was behind her, but its lessons lingered. Ambition, fear, and pride were threads that wove through every heart, and murder was but a stitch gone wrong. Craddock would call again, she was sure, with another puzzle, and she would be ready, her needles clicking, her eyes seeing what others missed. Chapter 12. A Final Stitch. The quiet of St. Mary Mead enveloped Miss Jane Marple's cottage like a soft shawl, the village's familiar rhythms a soothing contrast to the glittering chaos of London's fashion world. The late summer sun filtered through her lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the parlor floor, where Pearl, her tabby cat, stretched languidly. Miss Marple sat by her writing desk, a cup of Earl Grey cooling beside her, her knitting needles at rest for the moment. The gray scarf, a silent witness to the unraveling of Roland Pierce's murder, hung neatly over a chair, its final stitches a testament to her patient pursuit of truth. The newspapers, now a day old, lay folded, their accounts of Marcel Duval's arrest fading into the village's gentle gossip. Yet Miss Marple's mind, ever active, lingered on the case, piecing together its final threads with the care of a seamstress perfecting a hem. She had received a letter from Inspector Craddock that morning, his handwriting as precise as his police work, though tinged with his characteristic grumble. "The case is closed, Miss Marple," he wrote, "thanks to your meddling, though I'll deny saying so. Duval's trial is set for next month, and the evidence is airtight. The Palais is back to its shows, but they'll not forget this one." Enclosed was a clipping from Vogue Elegance, Roland Pierce's final review, which Miss Marple had read with quiet curiosity the previous day. Its praise for Marcel's collection, devoid of the plagiarism accusation, had stirred a question in her mind. Had Pierce's change of heart been genuine, or had his death ensured a kinder legacy than he intended? She rose, smoothing her skirt, and retrieved the clipping from her desk. The review, printed posthumously, described Marcel's designs as a masterful blend of homage and innovation, a stark departure from the damning draft accusing him of stealing Etienne Moreau's sketches. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, lingered on the words. Had Pierce reconsidered his verdict, seeing artistry where he first saw theft? Or had Lydia Crane, ever the shrewd editor, softened the piece to salvage her magazine's reputation? The question nagged like a loose thread, and Miss Marple, settling into her armchair with a fresh skein of wool for Joan's mittens, let her thoughts wander. The case had been a tapestry of human passions. Marcel's pride, Celeste's fear, Lydia's ambition, Victor's grudge, each thread vibrant yet frayed by the critic's pen. Marcel's confession, wrung from him by Elise's truth, and the reenactment's subtle trap, had confirmed his guilt. A moment of rage, sparked by fear of ruin, had driven the letter opener into Pierce's heart. The side door, the blackout, the missing blade from his atelier, all had aligned with his desperate act. Yet Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy for the designer, whose talent, however inspired, had been overshadowed by a single fatal choice. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Baker, whose pride in his craft had led to a bitter feud, resolved only when truth softened his heart. Marcel, she thought, had no such chance. Her reflections were interrupted by a knock at the door. Joan, her niece, breezed in, her cheeks flushed from a walk through the village. "Aunt Jane, you're famous," she exclaimed, brandishing a London gossip rag. "They're calling you the spinster sleuth who cracked the Palais murder. Honestly, you're wasted in St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple chuckled, her needles clicking into action. "Nonsense, my dear. A village is as full of mysteries as any catwalk, if you know where to look." Joan laughed, settling onto the sofa with a biscuit, and recounted the latest fashion world whispers. Celeste Varon's star rising despite the scandal, Lydia Crane's magazine securing new funds, Victor Hale's designs gaining a cult following. As Joan chattered, Miss Marple's mind returned to Pierce's review. Its unexpected generosity suggested a complexity to the critic she hadn't fully grasped. Had he seen Marcel's potential, or had he baited the designer, knowing his accusations would provoke? She thought of the crumpled note, "You'll pay for your words," and wondered if Marcel's fear had been stoked by Pierce's cruelty, or if the critic's change of heart had come too late. The truth, she decided, was like a final stitch. It held the fabric together, but its beauty lay in its simplicity. The afternoon waned, and Joan left to meet friends, promising to return with more London tales. Miss Marple, alone again, resumed her knitting, the mittens taking shape with each careful loop. The Palais case was closed, its secrets laid bare. But she knew life would bring new puzzles. Perhaps a village squabble, perhaps a letter from Craddock with another city crime. She smiled, her eyes on the horizon beyond her window, where St. Mary Mead's fields stretched toward the unknown. The fashion world, with its glamour and greed, was not so different from her village, where pride and fear wove their own dramas. With her needles and her quiet wisdom, Miss Marple was ready for whatever thread came next.